Yo, KenDeep here. This time around, I want to talk about something that's usually a topic, well, quite often, honestly, in the fighting game community, but doesn't really see a common ground because there are a lot of different definitions for it. And the topic I want to talk about is neutral. Now, hear me out. Neutral as a concept, of course, exists, right? But usually the term is so loaded with different interpretations that it easily gets sidetracked into a argument into what game is better or what game has proper neutral. But what exactly is neutral, and how can we use that knowledge of what neutral is to apply it to games that might differ from game to game? Well, that's something that I want to address in this video, and I hope you learn something from this as much as I will. You're on board? Let's get to it. So right at the gate, neutral is usually used synonymously for mid-range situations or the round start, but by definition, those can't be neutral in a literal sense. In the round start, there are characters that are favored by default because they have better starting options, they have the proper normals for these specific ranges, or they have the movement options that, favor them in that regard. Same way around, also other characters have disadvantages in the round start situation. Aside from mirrors, of course, we cannot use the term neutral for something that is literally neutral. If that's not the case, then what else could it mean? Maybe let's start with eliminating cases first. There are certain situations where we don't regard this scenario as neutral. For example, corner situations. Even if the corner situation is not inherently offensive or oppressive situation, like if one character is cornered but still in a footsie, situation, though footsie is also a pretty loaded term. And there are also situations like mid-screen but close up, when someone is in a block string. We don't regard that as neutral either. So with all these situations and more that I haven't even mentioned, we can kind of guesstimate a certain similarity that all of these situations have, which is the ideal scenario that a character can enter. So some players also call this the win condition. For clarity's sake, I'm gonna call it the ideal scenario. Now, why these ideal situations are very important is because they allow the player or a character to not only increase their chances to win the match, but they also minimize the risk of losing the match. And that is actually more important, to be in such a significant positive situation that any risk of losing is going down and down the further it goes. Now, for example, Heiyun wants to have you on knockdown with a tuner ball setup, Belia wants you to be cornered while being close up, while Dalsim generally wants you to be a little bit more mid-range while cornered. And if we have identified what constitutes as a win condition, then maybe we can also identify what a neutral situation is, which is not all these situations, but instead something that leads to these situations. Ergo, the battle for momentum. Man, that's a roundabout way to come to that conclusion. Honestly, it's not really even scientific or publicly approved. I mean, as mentioned, this term is really loaded and super ambiguous. This is just my take on the damned word neutral. But now that we have this out of the way, then maybe we can actually tackle the real problem that we have in the FGC with this specific term.
The quality of the game is defined by its neutral.
Yeah, that's a quote that happens sometimes. Now, fighting games are something that are quite homogenized. Some games have dashes, some have runs, some have double jumps, some have air dashes. A couple of them even have triple jumps. And the list goes on and on and on, right? It's usually these very specific things that differentiate one game from another. Now, from time to time, we do have games that, try to differentiate themselves a little bit more. Air dash games actually got ridiculed for a long time because they were mix-up heavy games that didn't regard neutral. And the same is also true today for Dragon Ball FighterZ, where we can have a skip neutral button. And while that's certainly funny, I mean, I joked about this too, it's a very single-minded thought. It's exactly these mechanics that make Dragon Ball the unique game that it is today. There is rarely any other game that comes even close, except for maybe Arcana Heart. Think about it. The dynamic with the super dash, the vanishes, the float properties, they all make this game very high paced in its neutral and very stressful to play, but at the same time it really encompasses what we think about Dragon Ball as an IP. It's honestly the ideal Dragon Ball fighting game from a mechanical standpoint. And no, this isn't supposed to be a Dragon Ball positivity video. I mean, this is true for all fighting games. In KOF, it's elemental that you are able to hop over lows in order to punish them more effectively and more quickly, which is something that you can't do in Street Fighter, for example. And at the same time, in Guilty Gear, at least in Exert, being able to cancel your specials for momentum shifts, in the literal term with your movement momentum, is also quite unique and defines a lot of the game. The same can also be said about Street Fighter in itself as an IP. When you look at Alpha, being able to just walk back and forward was, the status quo for a long time. But then suddenly there was Street Fighter 3, new generation, that suddenly you were able to dash. And that made a big difference in how the game is going to be played. I look at Fightcade and I see so many fighting games I've never even touched before, or if I've even heard of. I always think, man, there are so many games with so many different takes on how this genre is supposed to be played. Why should I just go with my preconceived notion on how to approach this game? And the reason why I'm addressing this is because the reason why we ridicule other games sometimes is the same reason why we fail to improve at the games that we do like. Understanding how they work and how we can utilize that knowledge to an advantage is really elemental and very important in order to improve at a game. And now, we have come full circle. How do I win the game? How do I win the momentum? And how do I gain the advantage? Also known as, how do I win neutral? The question is so contextual and so dependent on the mechanics and the characters and the features of the game that it would be a disservice to try to teach you otherwise. And because everything is so dependent on what you play, it would do well for every player to, not judge a game by its surface, but instead to try to analyze it a little bit further and see how it differs from the other games that you're used to. And maybe even if the game that you're maining right now, you can see it for yourself what exactly works and maybe why it doesn't work the way you think it does. Being able to have that analytical thinking and critical thinking, I think is very important, not only for the neutral game, not only for the fighting games, and not only for competitive gaming in general, but I think this is a skill that will help you in life in general. And to close this all off, I just want to mention something really quick. This whole thought of how to play the game is something that inherently we in the competitive gaming want to prove, right? Every player has their own way to play, and everyone wants to prove how the game has to be played. That's why we play tournaments. The winner decides, hey, my approach was the right one, and I've proven that by winning that tournament. And that's why I want to use this channel not to tell you how to play, but to give you skills and techniques so you can find your own way to play. With that being said, thanks for tuning in and see you next time.